A good editor is worth their weight in gold, but only if you know how to use them properly. Unfortunately, I see so many first-time authors either hiring or planning to hire an editor when it is the total wrong strategy for their book. And this can get pretty expensive, not only now, but in the long term of your book. That's why I want to talk about the top 5 costly editor mistakes I see first-time authors make all the time. Stay tuned. You've got the story, you've got the idea, you just don't know the steps in the process. If this is what's holding your memoir back, I have got the solution for you. The Memoir Method Checklist is going to take you through every single step you need from idea to published marketable book. And you can download it now at pageandpodium.com/checklist. If you've been watching this channel long, you know that hiring a high-quality professional editor is a must if you want your book to be successful, either in the reader's market and or in the traditional publishing landscape. It is crucial that you get at least one editor's eyes on that manuscript before you publish or submit to publish. But when we don't know what's coming down the pike, it's really difficult to figure out the best strategy to make sure that that editing budget goes as far as it can. And unfortunately, too often I see exactly the opposite. I see first-time authors who make small errors in their calculations that end up costing them big, either at the time that they're hiring their editor or down the pike when their book does not do as well as they thought that it would, or as well as it could have if they'd invested their editorial money wisely. And that's why today I want to talk about the top 5 things that I see that cost people money when they're trying to hire an editor. And unfortunately, very often, the things that I'm going to describe here are things people do because they're trying to save money. But these are huge mistakes that are going to blow up in your face every single time. So let's dive in because I do not want you to make some of these mistakes that I see happening all the time. Okay, the first big mistake that I see is hiring the wrong type of editor. So I want to start by kind of giving you a preview of the timeline of when you would use these different types of editorial services before I kind of dive into what exactly each of them are, because I think it's really helpful to think about the stage of your manuscript as you're thinking about what type of editor it makes the most sense to hire. So with most manuscripts, you will start by just doing a quick and dirty rough draft, and Lamont calls this the shitty first draft, which is fine if you don't mind cursing, but essentially all we're doing is dumping out our ideas, we're getting the words on the page. We often know during that first drafting stage that there are going to be issues, and in fact, I hear this from our Memoir Method folks all the time that they got a little stuck, a little hung up, but as we coach them, they moved through. But of course, then you do know you will have to fix those large level issues after you finish that first draft. The first round of editing is probably you. Typically, what I recommend to authors is that you start by doing what's called a reverse outline. If you're not sure how that works, you can look back through our previous YouTube videos or blog posts for a post that's called How to Start Revising Your Draft. And that's going to walk you through step by step how to do this first round of revising yourself. And there's a really important reason that you are probably the person doing this and that you are the right person to do this. And that is that as you went through that first draft, again, you probably knew that there were things you wanted to adjust. And as you went through that first draft, you probably got much clearer on what you were trying to say in that book itself. Typically, I suggest that folks have a really clear plan. They know their message, they know their topic as they start writing. But that does not mean that as you go through, there are no changes to that. So usually when you start revising, right after you finish that first draft, you usually have stuff that you want to do. And that's really good. You should absolutely do that. And you should do that before you hire an editor. Once you have done the revisions kind of to the degree that you feel like you can do, the next stage is going to be developmental editing. Now, developmental editing can kind of take two different forms depending on what you're looking for, what your style is, what type of book you're doing. And that is either a manuscript review or a full developmental edit. A manuscript review is typically going to be a little bit earlier in the process than a developmental edit, although you can also do one or the other and be perfectly fine. This is just a matter of preference. A manuscript review is typically going to be done by an editor pretty early after you have done your revisions, and the purpose of this is not to give you a document markup. The purpose of this is to give you a high-level overview, 10,000 feet view of your manuscript in terms of the really large issues. So these are things like your overall structure, your pacing, your clarity of message and topic. They are things that we are going to see as the manuscript as a whole. But if somebody just gave you a chapter, you wouldn't be able to see that. They're things that are the entire full manuscript. When we at Page and Podium do a manuscript review, what we will typically do is deliver to the client an editorial letter. So we like to put in there some kind of marketing tips, what we see as the strengths of the manuscript, and we usually will include a pitch as well. But then the bulk of the letter is a full analysis of how we see the strengths of that manuscript playing out, what's going to be really attractive to agents and or readers, as well as the things that we call deal breakers. So the deal breakers are things that are going to pull your reader out of that manuscript, whether that reader is an agent, acquisitions editor at a publishing house, or just your regular reader, your regular audience. At the end of that letter, we're going to put some just really clear step-by-step things that we want you to fix. And we particularly try to focus on mistakes that we see over and over and over. So things that you are doing really frequently in the manuscript, because at this stage, we expect that you will still be going through the full manuscript and doing more of that high-level revision. The other type of a developmental edit is a much more traditional approach. The traditional approach to a developmental edit is going to be similar to a manuscript review in that you will get an editorial letter, but typically a developmental edit in the traditional sense is still going to be kind of between the very high level and getting a little bit more into the weeds. And for this reason, a developmental editorial letter can sometimes be 8, 9, 10 pages long. This is often going to be a list, a numbered list of things that that editor thinks that you should change as you're going through the next stages of your revision. The other document that you'll get from your developmental editor is going to be a manuscript markup. So in this case, they are going to take your Word file and then they are going to add inline comments, meaning there will be comments that are attached to particular words, phrases, or passages. And there will also usually be some tracked changes, meaning that there have been actual changes on the line level. Those will be kind of usually a different color and underlined, depending on how you're using Word. So those two things together are really kind of trying to guide you through the manuscript. Now, which of those is going to be the best fit for you? Really, it's just a matter of personal taste and style. What I typically suggest is if you are somebody who feels a little bit overwhelmed, if it's kind of difficult for you to work through a big list of stuff because you kind of freak out or you feel like you get kind of tired, that kind of really overwhelmed feeling. If that's you, if you want just a very, very simple set of instructions, a manuscript review, that's probably going to be your best bet. On the other hand, if you really thrive on having a lot of feedback and then kind of sifting through what you like and what you don't like, that's going to be a traditional developmental edit. Either way, this stage is happening right after you come out of your own personal revisions. After you have then made all of the revisions from either your developmental edit or your manuscript review, once you have settled on the entire manuscript and there is nothing else that you want to change, that's very important. The manuscript is final from your perspective. Then you're ready to move on to a copy editor. The reason I'm making such a big deal about how you need to be done making changes before you go to the copy editor is that most presses have a policy that once you've gone to copy editing, the author cannot make any additional changes. And there is a good reason for that, which is why I suggest authors adopt it as their own policy too. Once you have had your copy edit, you have a really clear sense and usually some fixes of things like continuity errors, meaning did you introduce that character the first time they appeared? Meaning things like, are you being very, very clear about the chronology of the narrative? Such that as the copy editor looks for those types of errors, if you then go back to revisions, you now need to get another copy edit. The copy editor is assuming that you are finished with revisions. So, what, besides looking for continuity things, does a copy editor do for you? Well, the purpose of a copy editor is to look at the line level. And what I mean by that is that they are looking for things all the way from your word choice. So for instance, if you are very, very wordy, it may be that that copy editor can condense what you're saying a bit, give it a little bit more punch. They may be looking for things like helping you bring your voice out, so looking at particularly beautiful areas of the writing and then thinking about how those can be incorporated elsewhere, all the way down to things like grammar, spelling, etc. So once you get to copy editing, you are not going to want to make any more revisions. Any change you make, any new material you add, that material has now not been copy edited. And for that reason, we save copy editing for almost the last stage of the manuscript finalization process. The only thing that should happen after the copy edit, besides, of course, things like layout and design, is the proofreading. And I really wanted to bring this in here because even though we don't always think of proofreaders as editors, they are. We just don't think of them that way often. Your proofreader is the most detailed editor on your project. A proofreader is going to focus every time on things like correct punctuation, correct grammar, correct spelling. They are looking at the black and white issues in your manuscript, the right or wrong things. They should not be changing words around. They should not be making any kind of structural suggestions. A proofreader is meant to look at the tiniest tiny detail. So we can think of it as kind of a range. If you think of a developmental editor, remember I said earlier, they could not just take one chapter or one page and really be able to do their job. A copy editor could do that. They could work with one chapter. You're missing out on some of the things they can do in that case, but they could do their job more or less with a single chapter. A proofreader can do their job with a single paragraph. So we can kind of think about how close is that person looking at your manuscript, not in terms of how careful they're being, but how zoomed in they are in terms of your manuscript. So from this timeline, I think it's probably pretty clear why it's such a mistake to hire the wrong type of editor. If, as so many first-time authors do, you are planning to go from your self-revision, or, as I'll talk about in a second, not even your self-revision, straight to your copy edit, you are now wasting money because there is no possible way that you are going from your own self-revision, no feedback in the middle, all the way over to a copy edit where now you are locked into that copy edit unless you want to go back and start the whole process over again. So hiring the wrong editor is a really, really expensive mistake. And what I most often see people do is skip the development. I very strongly recommend that you get either a full developmental edit or a manuscript review. At the very least, you need to be getting feedback. But once you've gotten to your copy editor, just remember, that's the end of the changes. Any changes you make, you're going to have it re-copy edited. So make sure you don't jump the gun and get that too early. It's going to cost you a lot of money when you have to start adding up those copy edit mistakes. Okay, the second mistake that I see so often, very, very closely related, is that I will see people thinking they can just write their first draft and then they will hire an editor to fix it. Now, I just went through the whole process of all the stages of editing, so you can no doubt spot the error in this thinking already, but just in case, let me kind of talk through how this usually shows up. Typically, I will hear this from people who are kind of thinking about a book coach, and then they decide they're not going to get a book coach, they will just get an editor later. The problem is, what a book coach will do for you is make sure your book is structured well. And remember what I said earlier? Even if your book is structured well, even if you have drafted it, even if you have gone through your reverse outline revision stage, you still get to the manuscript review or developmental edit, and you are still going to get structural feedback. To imagine that an editor is going to make that structural feedback for you, that they are going to move your structure around and edit in that way, is not thinking of an editor. You are thinking, in that case, of a ghostwriter. And here is where the issue comes in, because the problem is that ghostwriters and editors have vastly different rates. You can hire a huge range of ghostwriters, but typically you will not hire a ghostwriter for under 5 figures. And in fact, many work for 6 figures or more. So when you think that you will just hire an editor to rewrite your manuscript effectively, you're really fooling yourself, and you're setting yourself up to have a manuscript that actually needs a ghostwriter. So what do we do here instead? The much smarter way to go about this is to get some help early on. Do not imagine, if you don't know how to structure a book, that you can just have an editor fix it later. The best way to get the right structure on your book is to plan for the right structure on your book. Yes, this means you got to slow down at the beginning to speed up down the line, but stopping to do that outline rather than just free writing means that you don't have to go from your first draft to a ghostwriter. Now you can go from your well-structured first draft into your developmental editor. That is the ideal way to do the process. And I promise you, if you try to give that first draft to an editor, you're going to be disappointed. They're either going to reject the manuscript as not ready to work with them if they have a very high integrity. They're going to copy edit it, which is going to be a total waste of your money, or they're going to suggest you hire a ghostwriter. None of those are the outcome that you want. So let's avoid that at all costs. Okay, the third mistake I see so often when people are going into this editing stage is that they dramatically underestimate the training an editor has. Importantly, copy editing is a really, really special skill. This is something that the best copy editors develop over years and years and years. Often they have advanced degrees that have cost them into the mid to high 5 figures or even 6, and they have often spent years and years of their lives honing this craft. So you can imagine how much it hurts my heart when people tell me that their grandmother is very good at grammar and is going to be happy to edit it for them. Now, that is nothing against your grandmother. I bet she is really good at grammar. But as you can tell from going through that whole list of the editorial process, it doesn't really matter if your grandma's good at grammar. She probably is, but she's not going to be able to do the job of an editor. Now, why is this in my list of costly mistakes? Because very, very often what I will see is that people will have their grandmother go through that draft and it will come out worse than before. The problem with having your grandmother or mother or aunt or uncle or English teacher do your editing for you is that very, very often these folks who are not trained in the industry expectations of editing are going to be so black and white about correct versus incorrect grammar. If you have read books recently, which I hope you are, if you are in this writing zone, you will know that very often we are fudging some of these very specific grammar rules to make books more readable. People do not care if your grammar is exactly right according to the standards of the mid-20th century. They don't care about that. What they care about is that you sound friendly and approachable and conversational. But what I find is when people have real amateurs do their editing, first of all, that amateur is really only looking oftentimes at grammar, more it's proofreading. And the other thing is that they often make it worse. So we want to make sure as we're moving through that we're being very, very efficient. And while we appreciate our relatives and friends and former teachers' offers to do some editing for us, it is just typically not the most efficient way forward. And being more efficient is always going to save us money. Okay, the fourth thing that I see people do so often is that they will wait until the last minute. I will tell you, as someone who runs a publishing house, editors have big backlogs. Very, very often you will find that editors are booked 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, a year in advance. And what that means is if you want the best talent to work on your manuscript, you need to have a plan. Good news, I have a tool that's going to help you with this. You can download our memoir method checklist at pageandpodium.com/checklist. It is going to help you plan out the whole stage so that you know about when you're going to be ready for editing and you can try to get on their calendar. Very often they're going to require a deposit. This is especially true, again, for the best editors, and you want to make sure that you're thinking early of who you want to work with. Again, this can be a little bit hairy because as you're going through the process, it's kind of hard to know when you're going to land. But the most important thing is making that contact early enough. Too often, I will hear from people who get on our calendar, they want to talk about editing or they want to talk about coaching, and they'll say like, well, I'm really hoping to have the book out by the end of the month. And as you heard me say, when we're going through this whole list of editors, you're just not going to be able to do it in a couple weeks or even a couple months very often. And here's where I want to go into another misconception and just a bit of kind of context on the editing process. With both developmental editing, in which you're getting feedback suggestions, and with copy editing, in which you're getting line level suggestions, there are usually multiple rounds included in your contract. So let's take copy editing for instance. You have done all your revisions that you could do yourself. You got some feedback, hopefully, ideally from a developmental editor, and then you made the revisions that they suggested, and now you get into the copy edit. What's going to happen here is that your copy editor is going to go through and mark track changes for the most part, but they will also usually put some comment bubbles for things that are unclear, for example, quotes that are not correctly cited, for things that seem to be out of order, for instance, a character who is introduced on the second appearance rather than the first. There are going to be comments for things like that. And for that reason, because remember, I made such a big deal about not making changes after the copy edit, for that reason, you will usually do your first round, you will get that marked up document back, and then you will have an opportunity to make any suggestions or changes, accept and reject their line level changes, and send it back to them for a final pass. That is going to take some time. At Page and Podium, we will typically suggest that people give us 2 to 3 weeks for a copy edit. Sometimes it's a month, depending on how backed up we are. And then you will need time to review the manuscript, and then we will need another couple weeks to do that final pass. So already there, we're into at least 2 months. And for that reason, if you are on a deadline, you need to make sure that you are planning ahead. Okay, the fifth and final expensive mistake that a lot of people make in their process is that they will plan to just DIY the editing. I know I'm being a little confusing here because I already told you that right after you finish the first draft, you should be doing your own revisions. You can use that reverse outlining tip that I talked about in a previous video if you would like. But there is an end point for what you will be able to do yourself. And because we are in the year of our Lord 2025, let me also say there is an end point for what AI can do for you too. When we're talking about a full-length manuscript, you have invested so much time, and your time is worth something, right? So what I don't want you to do is go through, do the revisions, run your manuscript through ProWriting Aid or something similar to that, and then slap it up on Amazon. It is not a good idea. I know that folks do this with the best of intentions, and I know that not everybody has thousands of dollars to spend on an editor. But the thing that I want to caution you about is throwing away all of the hard work you spent in putting that manuscript together because you don't want to spend money on an editor. It is so much better to save up and wait a little bit longer until you can afford that editor than to rush through and try to DIY it. In the end, you will be so much happier, and you will be saving money by hiring that editor because I promise you that book's reception is going to be so much better. There is nothing worse than buying a book, cracking that spine, and seeing that it is just not very well put together. I don't want that for your book. You have invested so much time and love and energy. Trust me, you are saving money if you can save up and get that really high quality editor. Okay, I hope this has been useful. I hope you have learned a little bit about the different types of editing. If there is anything that I can do to help, please reach out. I would love to help you get that manuscript into shape where editors and agents and readers are going to love it. But in the meantime, happy writing. You know what they say, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And this is exactly what holds so many people back on their memoir projects. That is exactly why we created the Memoir Method Checklist, a full, complete list of every single step you need to take to get that memoir written, published, and marketed successfully. You can download it now at pageandpodium.com/checklist.